tonight's conversation emerges out of the teaching that I do in my History of Economic Thought class, where I've developed quite an affinity for Adam Smith. So I know I'm not alone in this crowd. So I'm glad to come and share some thoughts with you on Adam Smith's relevance to digital innovation and the platform economy. Right? So we all are enamored of these. We spend a lot of time fondling them, getting nervous when they're not in our pockets. Right? The world we live in has been transformed by digital technology. And many of you in the room are digital natives, and so you may just kind of think, okay, yeah, so whatever. Seriously, for those of us for whom we are not digital natives, this stuff is whoa. Right? So you may ask, okay, and this is all, all this fancy technology and all of the capabilities and the things that it unleashes for us, all of the ability for us to keep in touch with our friends and make friends with people who we've been friends digitally for years but have never seen each other in meet space until today, like Kevin Greer. That's a beautiful, great, wonderful thing. What does this 18th century guy, this political economist from Scotland, have to do with this, the economy that this represents? And that's the question that I place on the table for you today. These are just a couple of pictures of Smith's main works. On the left is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was his first work and what he considered to be his best work, written in 1759. And I always think of Theory of Moral Sentiments as being written in conversation with both his advisor, Francis Hutcheson, and his very dear great friend, David Hume, who had written his own work of moral philosophy 15-ish, 20-ish years earlier. On the right is the frontispiece and a nice little medallion picture of Mr. Smith, of his well-known An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. And we think of that as his premier work of economics and one of the founding documents in the field of economics. So I'm going to draw on both of these and in the next 40 minutes or so try to persuade you that Smith's ideas resonate with a lot of the things that we either are experiencing and thinking about and reflecting on in ourselves when we engage in the modern digital economy, or, to be normative about it, that maybe we should be thinking about and self-reflective about. So first I want to put a stake in the ground for the features of the digital economy that I want to focus on. And this is my list of them. When we think about the digital economy and we do what we always do in economics, which is we kind of zoom out a little. We try to simplify and think about, what are some of the just kind of systematic characteristics, abstracting from the details. We generally think of the digital economy as being characterized by having a lot of information, right? We are awash in information. Information costs are very, very, very low. It's easy for us to find stuff, as opposed to when Adam Smith was writing his works. In order to find the kind of information that you have at your fingertips on your phone, he would have had to go into Edinburgh and find a whole bunch of books, and he would probably have access to not even a quarter of what you access on a daily basis. We also think that the digital economy enables us to communicate more. We have more communications with more people. And I think that's true, but they are communications of a particular form and a particular nature that can differ greatly from our face-to-face communications, or they can be really similar. I think there's a lot in there for us to discuss. What I think of as the defining feature of the digital economy, which I alluded to yesterday when we were talking about COS, is that digital technologies dramatically lower transaction costs. So digital technologies make it a lot easier for us to engage and exchange with each other, and a lot cheaper. And so we can get a lot more value creation out of exchange, a lot more of those nice green welfare triangles of happiness. Well, at least when I teach them, they're green. But that's because green's my favorite color. And then I'm going to put another, what to you might seem like a wild card on the table, but it's another thing that I think is really important, and it's the third of the three things I'm going to discuss tonight, and that is the idea of permissionless innovation. And so when I say permissionless innovation, I don't mean, woohoo, free-for-all. What I mean is that when we think about the internet and why the internet has been able to grow and transform into such a platform, and I use the word platform very deliberately in its precise digital meaning, such a platform for innovation, for new product creation, new service creation, new business models, it is because within the legal constraints of kind of standard common law, contract law, torts, et cetera, and some technical rules, bottom-up industry rules about interoperability, right? So the fact that I was able to put my slides up here because I plugged my memory stick into a USB port, that's an example of a rule that determines interoperability, that makes things plug and play. Right? So the combination of some legal rules and some bottom-up emergent industry agreed upon standards for technology create if you meet that and you meet that, then you can hook whatever you want on the edge of the internet. And any of you who have ever programmed anything using like Twitter APIs or some other apps APIs, you know what I'm talking about. So those are the features that I want to focus on when thinking about the digital economy. And I'm going to pick up three themes. And of course, there are multiple themes that we could pick out of Smith. We could be here for weeks pulling themes out of Smith that are relevant to the digital economy. I'm going to focus on three. I love these pictures because they represent, in Smith's world, in the 18th century, these are the technologies for doing the kind of stuff that we do on the internet and that we do through our digitally enabled digital capabilities. Right? That on the left is a big merchant vessel. And that merchant vessel would sail around from Europe, sail around usually to the east, south around the bottom of Africa, and then over to India, and bring back spices and tea and cloth and every good thing. So that represents the extent to which we engage in exchange and trade using our digital technologies. And on the right is a engraving, I can't remember which, of maybe it's a woodcut, of a London coffee house. Coffee houses in London and the Netherlands were famous in the 17th and 18th century, both as being spots for conviviality. So very much like coffee shops are for us today, where you hang out, you do some work, you meet up with your friends, you gossip, you kind of, wonder what the other people are talking about. Right? So it's social and it's work. It's social and it's productive. And as a matter of fact, the coffee houses in the Netherlands are the origins of our financial markets. So that's why those images are there. But the three themes that I'm going to pull out of Smith, out of the many that I could have chosen, are the ones that I think are the most interesting. And hopefully, if there are others that you think are important or interesting, or questions that you have about the digital economy, things like automation and robots and drones, we can find something in Smith that we can talk about. So please feel free to bring that up in questions. So the three themes I'm going to pick up on of Smith's are his concepts of sympathy, mutual sympathy, and social distance that he develops in the theory of moral sentiments. The idea of mutually beneficial exchange. And I've pulled a lot of quotes from Smith because I really think he's a really great writer. And so I think tonight I want to let him do the talking. And so I pulled out a couple of good quotes for exchange that we can talk about. And then finally, the role that entry barriers and trade play. It was one of the pivotal motivators for Smith to write The Wealth of Nations. And so I want to take some of those themes and pull them forward and apply them to the digital economy. All right. So you ready? All right, let's roll. Let's start with sympathy and mutual sympathy, and I will try to be brief on this one, but this is a topic near and dear to my heart. Sympathy is something that Smith has a very precise definition of sympathy, and it's something that he thinks is the foundation of our ability to live together in civil society. We talked yesterday about how in both of the works, Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations, Smith front loads his arguments, right? That he just comes right out of the gate and he just starts giving you stuff. And someone yesterday said that like the first 3 chapters of book 1 of The Wealth of Nations is a big chunk of the value of the book. I might disagree with that a little bit, but certainly those 3 chapters are meaty and dense. And he does the same thing in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Boom, right out of the gates. The first sentence, he says, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." Right? So this is not a reciprocity, I'm happy to make you happy because at some point you're going to make me happy. Right? He's saying, no, we just, and he's asserting this right out of the gate, just putting it right on the table and asserting it, and saying we derive happiness from other people's happiness, and we derive sorrow from other people's sorrow. Right? And that's an important part, that's kind of the emotional anchor of his concept of sympathy. And he starts that, this is the very first sentence in the book. And then later in the first chapter he goes on to say, but whatever may be the cause of sympathy, he had chatted about a whole bunch of very interesting and insightful things about fleshing this out. But whatever may be the cause of sympathy, or however it may be excited, nothing pleases us more than to observe in other men a fellow feeling with all the emotions of our own breast. Nor are we ever so much shocked as by the appearance of the contrary. A man is mortified when, after having endeavored to divert the company, he looks around and sees that nobody laughs at his jest but himself. On the contrary, the mere mirth of the company is highly agreeable to him, and he regards the correspondence of their sentiments with its own as the greatest applause. So yesterday Bart used the phrase fellow feeling when talking about Adam Smith. And here's an example of how he uses this idea. Fellow feeling, feeling that connection with someone else. And if you feel really connected, like this guy feels really connected with his friends, and he tells them what he thinks is a hilarious joke, and the sympathy he wants is the shared appreciation of the joke. And so if he tells it and it's funny and they laugh, ha ha ha, then they all get it, they have that connection. He tells a joke, and it falls flat on the floor, and nobody laughs, and then there's that kind of awkward, okay, yeah, I'm going to go get a drink. That is a lack of sympathy, right? No fellow feeling has been achieved there. Right? So that illustrates this idea of sympathy. But I think there's more to the concept than just this feeling of connection, the emotional connection that we associate with our modern concept of empathy. It is that he adds on to that what I think of as kind of an evaluative or a judgmental, and I don't mean judgmental in like a judgy way, but I mean judgmental in a, evaluating someone's conduct for its propriety. This quote's a little lengthy, which is why I printed these out, but it really gets at the heart of this idea of his of propriety. As the person who is interested in our sympathy and hurt by the want of it, so we too seem to be pleased when we are able to sympathize with someone else, and to be hurt when we are unable to sympathize with someone else. We run to congratulate the successful, we condole with the afflicted, the pleasure which we find in conversation of one whom in all the passions of the heart we can entirely sympathize with, seems to compensate us and compensates the painfulness of the sorrow with which the view of his situation afflicts us. And so here he's talking about if someone has had something really sad happen to them and they come to you to share their experience and share their grief, and you console them, and he's saying, you feel their pain and you feel their suffering because of the connection, but you also feel the kind of warm glow of the fact that you are connected with each other and you can sympathize with each other. I like this quote a lot, but I will say on this topic, Smith is a little diffuse in the book, so it's really hard to come up with these kind of soundbitey quotes. But But the idea of propriety that he has in sympathy is that sympathy with someone else doesn't just involve the emotional connection, it also involves the evaluation of somebody's conduct in a particular situation. He tells a story of an old man out screaming in the street. And how do we evaluate his conduct? Well, it depends on why he's screaming. If he's screaming because he's in pain and somebody has just run into him and his friend is nearby, there's a justified reason for him to be screaming. His screaming is a proper response to what he's experienced, and we can enter into his pain and sympathize with him. What does this concept of sympathy, what role does this play for Smith? Smith argues that in civil society, sympathy and mutual sympathy are the foundation of our ability to live together as free and responsible individuals living together in peace, harmony, and cooperation in civil society. And I want to focus on the harmony. There's a reason I always pull the harmony word out of Smith, because harmony, what does harmony mean? Those of you who are musicians know what harmony means. It means someone's playing the oboe, someone's playing the violin, someone's playing the timpani, and we're all coming together. And when we come together in harmony, we create beautiful music, but we're not doing the same thing. Okay? It's not uniformity. We're all different, but we can come together to create, in harmony, some beautiful, ordered outcome, is what he wants. But Smith argues it has its limits. And in part, it's because we can't perfectly sympathize with each other. We can never be the exact same person in the exact same situation. Right? So if Bobby has something wonderful happen to her, I can enter into her joy and I can sympathize with her joy and be very excited for her. But because I have not had exactly her life experience, and I'm not the one who had the happy thing happen to me, I am limited. There's a limit to exactly how far I can sympathize with her. And the same thing for sorrow as well. What enables us to sympathize, though, is our imaginative capacity. Right? We can imagine, what if I were in that, not just what if I were in that situation, but what if I were Bobby, with Bobby's characteristics, Bobby's temperament, Bobby's view of life. What if I were her and I were in that situation? And then I can imagine being Bobby and being in that situation, and that's how we cultivate our sympathy. So you can see why. I'm fascinated by this because it really hooks into a lot of modern cognitive science. There's actually a lot of modern cognitive science that hooks into this idea of imaginative capacity. Or for those of you who are philosophers, there's a lot of discussion of theory of mind. So there's a big epistemology hook here as well. Another limit for Smith, and I don't want to go into this in a lot of detail, although it's a fascinating aspect of the theory of moral sentiments, is how social distance is a limit for Smith. And by social distance, he means that we sympathize most with people with whom we are most familiar. It's easiest for us to sympathize with our family because we know them the most, we're the closest to them, we have the most similar life experiences. And then he kind of visualizes this as kind of radiating concentric circles out. So the next easiest people for us to sympathize with are our friends, and then our neighbors, other people who live in our community, other people who live in our same nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these different social distances, and our ability to sympathize is going to vary with that social distance. Now, you can see why I'm thinking about this in terms of digital economy, right? What does digital economy do to our social distance? What does social media do to our social distance? I would not say that it does anything linear, but I would say it sure discombobulates the heck out of our social distance. That's the connection I would like to draw between Smith's concept of sympathy and mutual sympathy. Right? The idea not only that I can sympathize with you, but you can sympathize with me, and we know that we're sympathizing with each other, and it's like that resonance, and you just feel wonderful. This picture on the left just represents this for me. When I was putting together my slides, and I'm kind of trotting through Google Images, looking for people laughing, I think was what I searched for. It was 2 people laughing. And I saw this picture on the left, and I just felt this warm kind of wave wash over me. I'm like, yes, you know, you can just see from the looks on their faces that they are sharing a really connected moment. So the question is, to what extent can we do that with digital technology through social media? Right? We have tweets and likes and pictures and chats and blog posts and little, you know, hearts on Instagram, and we can friend people on Facebook, right? So that's kind of the question: to what extent does our digital technology enable us to cultivate and enlarge that fellow feeling? I think it does. You know, there are plenty of people with whom I feel, and I think we all have this experience, can feel more connected and stay in better touch with, have a richer relationship with, feel like we can share more information and more experiences with. You can go out and meet people you would never have met before. I have stories I could tell about that having to do with going to a lot of concerts a few years ago, but I won't. Maybe at the reception, ask me about my renegade fandom that came about because of the internet, and I'll tell you. And so I think the internet connects us, right? It connects us, and it connects us with more people in more places than we've ever been able to be connected before. But there's a dark side, right? And I think we're all very familiar with the dark side. There's internet shaming, there's trolls, there's bots. Don't feed the trolls, don't engage in the Twitter outrage machine. So there's a dark side of this Smithy and Sympathy, right? Because that internet shaming, the kind of Twitter outrage machine is fed by that same impulse toward sympathy with others. But it's a excluding impulse, right? I will feel sympathy with this group of people in mocking this other group of people, or shaming this one person, which is very anti-Smithian, right? I do not think that Smith would count that as conduct that meets with propriety. But I think Smith has something to say for us that we can use when we think about this kind of negative effects that we see of social interactions and social media. And it is this concept of the impartial spectator. One of the biggest innovations of Smith's theory of moral sentiments is that he developed this I don't know what to call it, device, mechanism, construct called the impartial spectator. And the way I think about it, if you've ever seen any Austin Powers movie, you know that Austin Powers has a mini-me, right? And so the mini-me, you're all looking at me like blankly. Have you never seen an Austin Powers movie? I know I'm old, but... Okay, so there's a mini-me that sits on his shoulder. It's like, eh. And so think of this as a mini-me that is sitting there in your shoulder, basically whispering in your ear, evaluating your conduct. And so basically saying, do you think that's the right thing to do? Why are you doing that? Are you sure that that's the right thing to do? And, you know, asking you to reflect on your own conduct. Are you behaving with propriety? Given your situation, is this choice of your choice of your conduct consistent with a notion of propriety? And I'm going to do a big old hand wave over how we define the concept of propriety, but we can talk about that in questions. But the impartial spectator, and this quote is great for this. This is the top of the back half. He says, when I endeavor to examine my own conduct, because remember, sympathy involves, we're evaluating the situations of others. Can I sympathize with Bobby in her joy in her situation? I'm thinking about her behavior and her conduct given her situation. I'm evaluating her, but you know what? I can also flip it and do the same and evaluate my own conduct. And that's what Smith is encouraging us to do. And he says, when I endeavor to examine my own conduct, to pass sentence on it and either approve or condemn it, it is evident that in all such cases I divide myself, as it were, into two persons. So one person is the examiner and judge, that's the spectator, and the other person is the actor. Right? And that's the person that's doing the conduct. And so the idea is the examiner and judge, you kind of float out of your own body and evaluate what you're doing, and to try to be as objective and as disinterested, is the word he used, as disinterested as possible. to be as impartial as possible. And I think that's an important and useful insight that we can use when we think about some of the negativity that we see in social media, is that we can reflect on our own conduct and use the impartial spectator to say, is it really proper for me to respond to that person in that way? Or is it really proper for that person to respond in that way? And if I ask that question and I decide no, then I'm not going to enter into that outrage machine. Or, you know, if I think it's just not really proper to go respond to that person, right? Don't feed the trolls, don't feed the trolls. It's a very kind of Smithy and Spectator thing. But the idea is, but this is a challenge, right? And Smith knows this and warns us because we are inherently partial about ourselves. And you know this for your own, you know, you can come up with all kinds of ways to rationalize decisions that you make. Oh yeah, I'll just have that cookie because I'm going to go for a run later. And, you know, there are all sorts of ways that we come up with to rationalize and make partial decisions when an impartial spectator might say, you know, maybe it's not proper for you to do that. So that's kind of an overview of Smithy and Sympathy and the impartial spectator as applied to social media. The second topic is the idea of mutual benefit and mutually beneficial exchange and the sharing economy. Now, I want to pick this out. Every single person I think so far has mentioned the butcher, the brewer, the baker, right? That passage, right? And this is definitely when you do what, and I call these, actually whenever I teach history of thought, I always, in any of my authors, I always refer to their sound bites, right? So like Joseph Schumpeter has the perennial gale of creative destruction, right? Which is a great phrase. All the authors have sound bites, and the butcher, the brewer, the baker is one of Adam Smith's sound bites. I like having the entire passage because it really couches the idea of gains from trade and why it is that we have this propensity to truck, barter, and exchange that he thinks is innate to us as humans. You know, what is really going on there? And so the quote says, "But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren." So this is in Book 1, Chapter 2, right? And so remember, in Book 1, Chapter 1 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith, right out of the gate, is giving us the punchline of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations is the division of labor. Division of labor leads to specialization. Specialization increases productivity. Productivity is what increases wealth. And so because we're specialized, and that means that we aren't just self-sufficient, we have to rely on each other for other things other than what we produce ourselves. And that's the sense in which he says we have constant occasion for the help of our brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. Okay? So think about that. If you're a merchant and you're selling something, and if you go up and say, okay, I'm selling coffee, here, buy my coffee, because if you buy my coffee, my kids are going to have a really good dinner. Is that going to entice you and lure you into buying my coffee? Probably not as much as, oh, these delicious, single field, roasted freshly today, gorgeous beans with this lovely aroma. You would just have the most amazing experience if you buy my coffee. You're just like, whoa. And then people will stampede to buy my coffee. Yes. Win. But then you'll also, as long as I'm being truthful, you will have a lovely experience, and that's the mutually beneficial exchange. That's the gains from trade. So notice, what have I done if I've done that? I have had to put myself in the shoes of the person who's potentially buying my coffee. I have to put myself in the shoes of my potential buyer. Again, this is an impartial spectator activity. Right? How would some other person, who I'm trying to get to buy my stuff, how should I interest them in buying my stuff? And so then he says, whoever offers to another a bargain of any kind proposes to do this. Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want, is the meaning of every such offer. And it is in this manner that we obtain from one another the far greater part of those good offices which we stand in need of. Right? So that's all awesome. And even if he just stopped there, you would be like, yes, gains from trade. But he goes on. And he says, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. So it's really putting yourself in the shoes of others, and that's what enables you to come up with the exchanges that people are going to find mutually beneficial. And that's why trade is made of win. Right? Exchange is mutually beneficial, and it's the fundamental logic behind all of the online commerce that we engage in on a daily basis. And I don't know about you and your Amazon behavior, but my Amazon behavior is kind of, I came home from a trip and my husband was like, you got 4 packages while you were gone. Of course, one of them was paper towels, but which is an amazing feat in of itself, right? Why on earth are we now buying paper towels and having them? I mean, that's just a beautiful thing. So, you know, the sharing economy, ride sharing, Airbnb, all of these are grounded in this fundamental concept of exchange that Smith introduces to us. In Book 1, Chapter 3 of The Wealth of Nations, it's a chapter entitled Division of Labor is Limited by the Extent of the Market. Smith makes a really beautiful argument about the extent to which transportation networks and the growth of transportation networks enables you to enlarge the market over which you can buy and sell. And that enables you to have deeper and deeper and deeper division of labor, which gives you more and more specialization, which gives you more and more productivity, which gives you more and more wealth, and it makes everyone, even the most, you know, the worker in the factory, have the shared and universal opulence with other members of English or British society, I should say at this point. Because of all of this productivity that creates so much wealth, the common worker in England lives as well as an African king. The internet is this process on steroids, right? This idea of transportation networks. The internet is this process on steroids. How does this mutually beneficial exchange, growth of the network, how does that happen with the digital economy? It's all about reducing transaction costs, right? The dramatic fall in transaction costs. And so these transactions costs, as transactions costs fall so dramatically, and that changes boundaries of firms, that changes the natures of the products and services that we create and that we exchange, and firms themselves will evolve and change what they do and how they do it. If you combine that with Schumpeter's perennial gale of creative destruction, I think you have a really good model of the dynamic digital market economy. Another connection between Smith and the digital economy is the vital role of innovation. And we know that that's become almost a trait observation about the internet, is so much innovation, we can't even keep up with the pace of change. The pace of change in the 1780s was a lot slower, but Smith still marveled at the kind of change that he saw. Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 1, he's talking about this division of labor and how labor and capital, how humans and machines work together to be more productive. And that if you specialize, and you specialize it, and this is the pin factory discussion, you specialize in a particular task with a particular machine, you get really, really expert at that. You develop skill, dexterity, and judgment that makes you a really productive worker, which raises your wages, which makes you better off. He also talks about people who come up with new machines and how the workers who themselves work with machinery are the ones who are likely to come up with new machines because they're so familiar with the production process. And they're the ones who know the best ways to improve the process. And so you can think of this as kind of a Hayekian and local knowledge. In the first fire engines are steam engines, by the way, and James Watt's patent on the double acting devices that were the heart of the steam engine, his patent was in 1776, the same year as The Wealth of Nations was published. So steam engines were kind of a new exciting thing at the time. In the first fire engines, a boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder, according as the piston either ascended or descended. So the way a steam engine works is it's a double-acting piston. So you've got pistons going up and down, and there's a boiler, and that's what's creating the pressure to make the pistons move. If you have too much pressure buildup in your boiler, bad things happen. You have huge explosions, it's very dangerous, and so there's a pressure valve. And so typically what happens is they would have little kids who would, be there to make sure that the flappy doodle opened on the pressure thing. And so this clever kid in Smith's story comes up with a way to automate his job. He put himself out of a job. Why? Because he wanted to go play with his friends, because he's like 10. And so he wants to go play with his friends. And so he comes up with a way to automate the valve regulator. That's innovation. And it's a beautiful thing. It leaves him at liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of a boy who wanted to save his own labor. Now, what does this have to do with the digital economy? Clearly, like I said, innovation is a big part of what we think about. And so the connection I would like to make with Adam Smith is to Vint Cerf. Vint Cerf is one of the pioneers of the internet, one of the people who invented the internet. And in a New York Times op-ed in 2012, he asked the rhetorical question of himself, what is the secret sauce that made the internet such a rich, vibrant platform for innovation, for new products and services, for new business models that have created so much value and changed our daily lives? And he says that it was the fact that the internet was a platform for permissionless innovation. Right? As long as you obeyed the technical aspects, right? So you used TCP/IP protocol for your networking, and there were common shared standards for interoperability for both hardware and software. You could do whatever you want and hook anything you want around the edge of the network. To summarize, I think the internet can make experiencing fellow feeling easier. And I think we all have experiences of this. Folks sitting along the back row are a testimony to my feeling of fellow feeling that I get on the internet because I am in constant communication with these folks, and I'm very happy about that fact. And it enriches my life. Our impartial spectators help us create and enjoy sympathy and mutual sympathy and contemper our tendency towards outrage and encourage us to engage in self-reflection. Smith in his critique of mercantilism talks a lot about entry barriers and how there are entrenched incumbent interests who want to try really, really, really hard to use their relationships with the crown, in his case, to maintain their status in markets and to try to erect entry barriers. So digital technologies can make us more productive and prosperous. And we know that the internet grew in a framework of permissionless innovation with low entry barriers and little rent-seeking incumbency, and that it can continue to do so. And I want to keep all of these green cans, can do, can do, can do. And I want to add one final thing about Smith. One of the things that Smith says that we use and that is part of what makes our impartial spectator and makes all of this stuff work that he's talking about, and it is our capacity for self-command. Right? That if we can reflect on ourselves, reflect on our conduct, reflect on the propriety of our decisions, and engage in self-command, that whether we are interacting with our friends on the internet or engaging in commerce, or if we are a policymaker thinking about whether or not to regulate some piece of the digital economy, that some self-command might be in order to help us reflect on whether or not that would indeed be the prudent choice.
Application we can get from just going on Amazon all the time and making it so easy to get things. Are there any downsides to these lower transaction costs that are just too instant? Or should we make it harder to go out and research and do things?
That's a really, really excellent point. Right, that I did say there was kind of a dark side, the kind of social media dark side for Sympathy, but there's also a bit of a dark side for transaction costs, right? It's so easy to go on Amazon and just be like, sure! Because of that I have a pile of books that's like this high. So, and that's where I think this idea of self-command comes in, right? So Smith would say, that's the point where you step away from the computer, step away from the phone, maybe think for half an hour and say, okay, what's my life going to be like if I don't have that thing? Right? And so I think that's, but being aware of that those low transaction costs create so much value, but they also make it so easy to be just indulgent and to make that instant gratification. And Smith would say your self-command should encourage you to, back off and be a little more patient. So, excellent question. Yes, sir.
Do you think just like those little areas which is super easy to innovate, it also makes it super easy to innovate in the wrong direction, just making it easier to commit crimes and things like that over the internet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with like bots and identity theft, and there are bad actors who want to do bad things. I read Smith very much as being a don't cut off your nose to spite your face kind of guy. I think if he were standing here would say, don't shut down the internet just because a few people are obnoxious and jerks and criminals. But find ways to use the rule of law and concepts of justice and our institutions of justice, and to enable them to evolve to keep up with the changing technology. And that he doesn't talk as much about. Work with our legal institutions to enable them to evolve to keep up with the technology. And this is where there's a tension, an irreconcilable tension with what Bruce was talking about earlier, right? This idea of emergent institutions and designed institutions. So emergent order and planned order. And I think there's some mix, and especially with technology changing so quickly, if we, some of the changes in legal institutions to get at criminal behavior happen very quickly. And that's like the kind of stuff that the engineers do, right? So behind the scenes, there are constantly engineers, like engineers who work for banks, engineers who work for companies that are at risk of this kind of losses from this, insurance companies and so on. They have engineers who are really working to try to tamp that down, knowing that it's a Sisyphean task and they're never going to fully get there. But so there is some emergence there. But you also have to think about, are there some ways that we can design our legal institutions to make them more resilient in the face of this fast pace of change? So I do think there's a tension there.
I think Smith would have argued or felt that it would be desirable to have friction and transaction costs go to zero.
I read Smith as being extremely realist, and like we talked about this yesterday, right? That all of the economists that we're talking about this week take humans as we are. And I read Smith as thinking that, they're never going to go to zero, but he didn't live in a world of zeros and ones, right? He didn't live in a digital world. Certainly in the kind of interactions, whether they're commercial or personal, I think Smith invokes the idea of self-command and the impartial spectator and prioritizes that before other alternatives. I think in a world where, your Uber driver really wants stars and your Uber driver is going to give you stars, and the same with your Airbnb host, there are some other kinds of incentive schemes that may...
Keeps everybody towing the line.
Yes.
I'm going to rephrase that question slightly and say, what do you think Ronald Coase thinks the transactions costs would go to zero? And then I want to ask you about a little bit more about mercantilism, because and talk about the idea that if we think about mercantilism and the ways in which individuals were asking for privileges, right? I'm a big fan of the idea of thinking about mercantilism as a rent-seeking society, and that those elites who can in fact have control over the political system and so forth, who are extracting these things and not using commerce, right, to gain wealth and profit-seeking, as Smith would like to see them, but in fact using the power that day of the crown and so forth to make themselves wealthy.
Would Ronald Coase think that transactions costs are going to zero? I like that reframing because it puts another context for, kind of roping Smith back into that as well. Here's the chain of logic that I just went through in my head. I think that Coase would say transactions costs may, in terms of the digital aspects of transactions costs may go to zero, but there are always going to be some kind of other institutional aspects that we will never be able to eliminate because they involve the exercise of our judgment. And when I thought that really made me think that, that channel that Coase-Smith connection, right? Because Smith is all about our judgment and the exercise of our judgment. The idea of judgment and reflection is going to still be required. And so we won't be able to automate everything and drive transaction costs to zero. The Wealth of Nations is a book that Smith wrote deliberately as a response to the mercantilist policies in England, France, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, that were just prevalent in the 17th and 18th century. In particular, the idea that trade took place, long-distance trade in particular, took place through trading companies that were sanctioned by the crown. So, for example, the East India Company had been founded in the 17th century, and they basically went to the king and said, okay, give us your royal warrant so that we're the only ones who are allowed to trade tea in the British Empire from India. And they were the only ones who were allowed to trade tea. And then, of course, over time, the list grew of the things that only the East India Company was allowed to sell, which, by the way, was one of the foundations of the American Revolution. Was, one of the reasons that the Tea Party happened was because colonists were really ticked off about having to buy some more of that bloody East India Company overpriced tea and pay all these new taxes on it. The idea of mercantilism is front and center in Wealth of Nations, and his critique of it is eloquent and profound, and unfortunately, here we are 240 some odd years later, and with trade barriers and tariffs, and we're still having to fight against mercantilism every day. Solar tariffs, aluminum tariffs, steel tariffs, which raises the costs of precisely the people who we don't want to harm, which are the working poor. And Smith is very eloquent on this in book one, in book two, I think it was. But in talking about trade monopolies, he highlights really well that people buy their goods, and the East India Company has made a lot of profits on those goods in consequence of their monopoly, and that because of their comfortable monopoly, they have a lot of fraud and abuse. So he also identifies the corruption that is involved in that crony relationship between the Crown and the East India Company. Another area where he identifies the interest in maintaining incumbency and having high entry barriers is in labor guilds, and things like the statute of apprenticeship that said, if you're a silversmith in Sheffield, you're only allowed to have one apprentice every 5 years, which is meant to restrict the labor supply and keep wages high. Well, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time and attention.